I called the course Personality and its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are. Which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. You know, one of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you know, and you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind, and the answer to that is that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right. So it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right. You have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe we can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's really that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal, and then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So okay, so in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena, and that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful, and so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because That's the scientific method, removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because the collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. You can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that essentially that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're going to occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree. But that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much. And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. You know, so if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so, well, there's other constraints on the mechanisms of interpretation that you place in the world. So we could say, well, you're constrained in your interpretations by the constraints that other people place on you. But there's internal constraints as well. We talked about those mostly from a biological perspective, because you could also regard yourself in some sense as a loose internal society. And that's sort of a psychoanalytic dictum, right? You're a collection of sub-personalities, or you could say you're a collection of sub-routines. I don't care how you formulate it, but you're a unity, but you're a unity that brings together a plurality of subcomponents. And part of the constraints on how it is that you lay out your interpretation of the world is that you have to satisfy those internal subsystems, right? So you're the ego, but it's more like you're the captain of a ship full of people who are rowing. You got to keep the people rowing. You're not tyrant. You're not omnipotent tyrant of your own destiny. You're constrained by the nature of your own being. And so you have to provide yourself with food, and you have to provide yourself with shelter, and you have to provide yourself with water, and all of these things. And those are demands that are laid on you by the nature of your internal processes. And of course, how they lay themselves out as demands and what the appropriate solutions to that is, to those problems are, is debatable infinitely. But you can see the constraints stack up. You have to satisfy your internal constraints. So they have to be brought into a unity. That seems to happen, at least in part, between the ages of 2 and something like between the ages of birth and 4 years old, maybe even 2 years old. You bring yourself together into something that's sort of functioning as a unity. Then you have to turn that unity into a unity that can function in the social world with increasing breadth. And that unity in the social world has to be a unity that can function inside the natural world. It's something like that. So you're stacking up these games into a hierarchy of increasing complexity. And one of the questions that emerges from that is, well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? If it's a hierarchical structure, it has to be a hierarchical structure, because some things have to be worth doing more than others, or you can't act, which is another thing I really don't like about the postmodernist ethos, because it claims that value structures are there to eliminate, to exclude and oppress, and never once notices that, well, yeah, fair enough, but value structures are also there so that you know which way to walk, because you can't figure out which way to walk without saying that that direction is preferable to that direction. So you're stuck with the damn things. And they do exclude. Obviously, category structures exclude. The question is, if you're going to have a value structure, how is it that it should be constituted? Well, I already described some of the constraints. Like if your value structure is perfectly functioning except that you don't get enough to eat, that turns out actually to be a fatal problem, right? And it might be, you can run into all sorts of fatal problems. You're too lonesome. Well, it means let's say that your value structure is too narcissistic. There's lots of reasons to be lonesome, but that might be one of them. Or you're too timid or something like that. Like you're going to be informed by your own internal biological mechanisms when the value structure that you're laying out in the world is insufficient to keep itself propagating across time. And some of that's just you, and some of that's other people, and some of that's the natural world. Constraints galore. And so in the face of all those constraints, it's absolutely unreasonable to say any old solution goes. Try it. Generate a random solution. Run it as a simulation in the world. and see how many slings and arrows come your way. There'll be plenty. And you might say, well, I don't care about slings and arrows. It's like, yeah, no. That's a claim you don't get to make. So, okay, so you're being informed internally as to the nature of your value structure. You have to specify where you are. You have to specify where you're going. You have to integrate all your underlying biological mechanisms into that schema. It's something I think that's actually kind of weak about the Piagetian ideas, hey? Because Piaget, I'm a great fan of Piaget, but Piaget tended to think that the child came into the world with nothing but a set of reflexes. I mean, that's his technical claim, and that you bootstrap off those reflexes, and I think it underestimates the degree to which the child comes into the world as an already prepared unit. And I mean, he just thought of those things as so self-evident that you don't need to talk about them, but that's actually not true. You do need to talk about them. We know, for example, that if you provide children with food and shelter, and adequate food and shelter, but you don't interact with them socially, almost all of them die in the first year, right? It's not optional. Touch is not optional for children. Attention is not optional for children. Play is not optional for children. So it isn't just like, well, the child comes into the world with a set of reflexes and can adapt to any old environment. It's like, no, the environment has to be structured in a certain way or the child will die. And it's very interesting when it comes to things like play and touch, because you wouldn't think of those as fundamental necessities, right? But it turns out that they are. If you deprive a child badly enough of play and touch in the first 3 years of their life, even if they survive, what comes out at the end of that is often something that's like barely recognizable as a functional human being and cannot be repaired after that point. And that experiment was done with Romanian orphans back in the 90s. So it was an ugly situation, to say the least. Okay, so now you take these underlying biological systems and maybe they aggregate themselves into something that vaguely looks like your temperament, your 5 temperamental dimensions. So maybe if you're an extrovert, you're dominated by the dopaminergic system, just like you are if you're high in openness. And if you're high in neuroticism, it's mostly that you're dominated by anxiety systems and systems that mediate emotional pain. And if you're agreeable, you're dominated by the function of the underlying maternal/care affiliation systems. But so you could say, well, you've got a multitude of fundamental biological predispositions that manifest themselves as implicit stories, something like that, and they organize themselves into the primary temperaments, and the primary temperaments are biasing factors that determine in part the nature of the interpretive structure that you're going to lay out in the world. It's not entirely determined by your temperament. We know that personality is only predicting something like, let's say, 10% of the variance in most complex social outcomes. And the other elements are, well, temperamental as you might be, you still have to get along with other people and the world. So you come in with these internal biases, but they still have to be modified extensively by your social and your natural surround. Okay, and then you develop your routines from the bottom up, as Piaget pointed out, and sometimes from the top down, because now and then you can think yourself into a radical transformation. But mostly what you're doing is building the micro units of your interpretive schemas and your behaviors and aggregating them into higher order structures that you can then tag with higher order abstractions. And we talked about that. You can't tell a 3-year-old to clean up his room. And the reason for that is those are empty boxes as far as the kid's concerned. Clean? He might have room, he might have that. Clean he doesn't have. He might have pick up the teddy bear and put it in that space, right? So that's one of these little micro routines. And maybe you say, you put 20 of those micro routines together and now you can say, clean up your room. And basically what you're saying is, implement the 10 micro routines that you've learned. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you're a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they don't know how. Sometimes maybe the person's depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dormant. You got to get them awake again and implementing them. But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe, right? The parents never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun. And then, they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And you know, one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is, develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiations. And so you can sort of place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, you know, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where, you know, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like, you're hyper orderly. It's, well, get a dog, you know. Dogs are messy, horrible things, you know. It's just what you need if you're hyper orderly, because they're going to leave hair everywhere and force you to live with it.
If you're an agreeable person, and that means you're fundamentally compassionate and caring, you don't like conflict, you like to put other people at ease, you're likely to go along to get along. Now, the problem with being a caring person is that, of that sort, an agreeable person, is that you don't like conflict. You're going to always assume the best of others, and it's going to be difficult for you to say no when you need to say no. And what no means, by the way, just so that everyone who is listening is clear, no, when you say it to someone, means if you don't stop doing that, something you do not like will happen to you with 100% certainty. That's what no means if you dare utter it. It's useful to develop that side of your character too, the part that can bite back when bitten. Not more than necessary, but certainly not less than necessary. You know, if you limit someone's free speech, not only do you limit the rights of the person who's speaking, but you limit the rights of those who could have heard. And it seems to me that I believe that people have the intelligence to make up their own minds, and that they should have the information presented to them. My experience has been that people are far more intelligent and perspicacious than we generally assume. They come to the right conclusions. Who's to say? But, you know, I don't think there's anything more important than freedom of speech. I started doing what I'm doing back in, say, probably 1985, because I realized that one of the pathways to totalitarian catastrophe was deceit at the individual level. This is something that Solzhenitsyn made very much of, Orwell as well, Huxley as well. These great thinkers concluded in the aftermath of these totalitarian catastrophes that there was an integral link between pathology at the individual level, which was fundamentally the willingness to use deceit in an instrumental manner. I'll lie to you to get what I want, and authoritarian catastrophe, and that it was a direct causal link. And I actually buy that argument. I think that's literally true. And so partly what I'm doing, I hope, is helping people walk through thinking about why telling the truth is a good idea. Not only for them, not as a top-down, shake your finger moral injunction, don't lie, you shouldn't lie, but in a detailed manner to explain the relationship between the instrumental use of deceit and the collapse of civilizations. And that connection is way closer than people think. You know, so one person influences 1,000 people, for sure, in their lifetime, and sometimes a lot more than that. And 1,000, you know, the next rung out from that, 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000, and the next rung out from that is 1,000,000,000. And so you're always at the center of a concentric circle that 2 rungs out contains 1,000,000,000 people. Well, it turns out that what you do matters. And basically what I'm doing, I hope, is touring and talking to people face to face in these lectures, for example, and making the case that It's a terrifying case. Everyone says, well, we want meaning in our life. It's do you now? Do you now? Because you might ask yourself, what's the more threatening possibility? That nothing you do matters, which means you can pretty much do whatever you want. That's the upside of that nihilistic claim, no responsibility, right? And why not pursue narrow focused hedonism, since nothing matters anyways? So that's the shadow of nihilism. Or everything you do matters. And it's a lot more terrifying to contemplate that you will be held accountable for everything you do. And I believe that firmly, partly as a consequence of my clinical experience. I never saw any one of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, even once. And you think, well, people get away with things all the time. It's like, no, they don't. They might gain a narrow advantage in one dimension in the short term. But, you know, let's say that you use deceit in your business practices. First of all, that doesn't work very well because people will figure you out. So as a long-term strategy, it's terrible. It just doesn't work. No one is going to play with you if you're a cheat. But let's say that someone asked me the other day, well, what about these dictators that ruled their whole life, and they were at the top of the hierarchy, let's say, and they had all the power. Stalin's a perfectly good example. It's like, didn't he win? Well, everyone Stalin ever talked to lied to him because they were absolutely bloody terrified of him. His country was a nightmare. It was a hell, or as close as we've been able to produce, with the possible exception of the Nazis and the Maoists, but it was up there in terms of hell. And did he rule? Yes, but he ruled hell. And if you think that's a victory, well, go ahead and try it and see how much of a victory it is. You know, Milton's Satan said, I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. It's like, fair enough, go ahead. Use deceit, use instrumentality, rule in hell. You'll be the ruler. See how much good it does you. See where that takes you. It takes you somewhere terrible.
If you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either. You have to be all in this game. There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. You can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly. And if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it and I can see what happens. Once you orient yourself, then you have an obligation, I would say an obligation to the development of your soul to speak the truth. You have to be oriented properly, though, because the truth is something that exists in service to an ideal of sorts. Then you can imagine that you could use your language two ways. You can use your language to manipulate the world and to extract from it what you want. So, for example, maybe you go out on a date with someone and you decide that the end goal of the date is to have a sexual partner for the night, and then you can craft your language to manipulate the person into providing you with what you want. And that's like an instrumental use of language. But the problem with that, there's many problems with that, but one of them is that what if your idea about what you should want is wrong? Like maybe that's not the way to treat someone that you're on a date with, out on a date with. Maybe you're minimizing and reducing the interactions between you from what could be a healthy and elevated state of interaction and discourse to something that basically the pursuit of impulsive pleasure, and maybe that's not good for you next week and the week after and a month down the road. Maybe orienting yourself towards impulsive pleasure is a very bad idea. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. Pinocchio goes to Pleasure Island, and Pleasure Island is a place where impulsive pleasures can be had at a moment's notice. But what Pinocchio discovers, along with Jiminy Cricket, that Pleasure Island is run by masked totalitarians they're all dressed in black, you remember, and they're turning the children and adolescents who are on Pleasure Island, they're depriving them of their voice, turning them into braying jackasses and preparing to sell them as slaves to the salt mines. And so there's an implication in that story that the pursuit of impulsive pleasure is one route to totalitarianism and slavery, and I believe that. So perhaps orienting your language towards the gathering of impulsive pleasure is a misuse of your highest gift, the gift of logos, the gift of communication. The alternative is to orient yourself towards the highest good, as we already described, and then speak the truth. And you can tell when you're doing that, or you can tell when you're not doing that, because if you're not telling the truth, if you're using someone else's words, you're being manipulated in a sense by forces that are behind the scenes. You're not using your own words. You're the puppet of an ideology or another thinker or your own impulsive desires. And you can tell when you're speaking like that because it makes you feel weak. It makes you feel weak and ashamed. And you can localize that feeling physiologically. If you listen to yourself talk, you can tell when you're speaking properly, you will experience a feeling of integration and strength. And when you're speaking in a deceitful or manipulative manner, you'll feel that you're starting to come apart at the seams. And what you need to do is practice only saying things that make you feel stronger. And that'll mean, to begin with, that you'll notice that almost everything you say is a lie. It's either a lie or someone else's words. It's very hard to find your own words, but you don't actually exist until you have your own words. So then you try to teach yourself how to speak your own truth, and you listen to other people while you're doing that, because they can help you shape and correct your words. They'll react to them badly if you formulate your ideas badly, and if you listen and pay attention, then you can learn to formulate your words more and more clearly and accurately, and that makes you more and more powerful. It gives you more and more authority, which is the beneficial form of power. Okay, so you do that, and then you have to make a decision of faith, and that's basically, well, that you can either use your language to manipulate the world and make it do what you want, or you can use your language to try to articulate the truth as carefully as you possibly can, and then you can see what happens. You have to let go of your desire for the consequences that you want. You have to assume that if you speak the truth, the results are the best that is possible under the circumstances. And so it's an exciting way of living in some sense. It's like continually walking off a cliff, because you don't know what's going to happen next if all you do is say what you think. And maybe you're at work and you say what you think and you get fired and you think, oh my God, that's a terrible catastrophe. But maybe it's not, because maybe if you're working somewhere and you have to lie to maintain your job, maybe you shouldn't be there. Maybe it's deadening your soul and damaging you in some permanent manner and making you corrupt. And so you have to orient yourself. You have to speak the truth as carefully as you can. You have to listen to others so that you correct your speech. And then you have to allow the consequences that ensue to unfold as they will. That's the ultimate act of faith, I would say. And that's what you do if you belong to Truth University. All right, so more practically speaking, then you should educate yourself. And it's not that easy to do now, because you have to find people who can actually tell you mostly what to read and maybe also how to write, because writing is a way of formulating your thoughts ever more precisely. That's why you go to university, to learn how to write. If you know how to write, you can think. If you can think and speak and communicate in writing, you're unbelievably powerful in the authority manner, because arguments move the world forward. And if your arguments are tight and well constructed and lucid and well edited and carefully thought through, and you have 5 rationales for everything that you're doing, which is what happens if you learn to write properly, then you're like a force of nature, man. No one can take you down. And that's one of the things that people aren't taught about why you go get educated, especially in the humanities. Humanities education, if it's real, organizes your psyche, grounds you, puts you on a rock, and makes you a force to contend with. But you have to read the right people. And those are they're the great people of the past. In my list, they're the great men of the past, and that's just how it is. And so here's who I would recommend. I put reading lists up at jordanbpeterson.com. There's 2 of them. And the people that I recommend primarily are their books written by the following list of people: Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, who I think perhaps the greatest novelist the world has ever seen, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great Russian novelist. I don't know what it is about the Russians, but man, they produce writers that are incomparable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, where he analyzed the Soviet prison camp system that arose after the Leninist revolution in the second decade of the 20th century. and details in absolutely precisely how the tenets of Marxism, the Marxist tenets that are supposed to free everyone and change the world, produced legislation that was absolutely murderous in its consequences. And Solzhenitsyn painstakingly traces the logical pathway from the original Marxist principles to the legislation, to the genocides. Because you'll hear people who are basically Marxists say things like, well, true Marxism never existed. And Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart in the mid-70s, and the Gulag Archipelago was an intellectual bomb. It demolished any credibility that Marxism had to intellectual respectability. You have to read the book. The book is about the central issue in our culture at the moment. If you don't read it, you're not informed. You can't participate in the debate except as a puppet. And so I wouldn't recommend participating in this debate as a puppet, because you don't know who's behind the scenes pulling the strings. If you remember the Pinocchio story, the forces that were pulling the strings were not forces that were acting in Pinocchio's best interest, that's for sure. George Orwell, English essayist, incomparable commentator on socialist totalitarianism, even though he was a left-winger and a brilliant one. Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, had some very brilliant things to say about the potential demolition of sexual choice, of sexual partner as a part of a dystopian future. Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who described himself as someone who thought with a hammer. And Nietzsche is a very, very dangerous person and an absolutely brilliant writer. And Carl Jung, who was a student of Nietzsche, and who Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God back in the late 1800s, and Jung spent his whole life attempting to revivify God. That's one way of thinking about it. And so if you educate yourself, and this is a really good place to start, if you read these authors, then you'll know what else to read. If you read these authors, it'll take you a good long time, and it will be very, very hard on you, and you won't be the same person when you come out, and that's very frightening. And because being torn down and rebuilt is no joke, but it beats the hell out of the alternative, which is just to stagnate and stay a stagnant infant, which is not something I recommend. There's nothing uglier than a stagnant 40-year-old infant. So vision. Well, how do you develop a vision? Well, you might want to think about, how would you like your life to be? So we could make this practical. We say, this is how you bring heaven down to earth. That's to make the abstract practical. And that's always very useful. That's the differentiation of Jacob's ladder, by the way. That's the axis mundi, the central point of the world. It's like, well, what do you want? Well, you could ask yourself that. If you could have what you wanted, what would that be? So we could throw out some possibilities. People trust you. People respect you. And you deserve the trust and the respect. It's not false. People can rely on you. You're good for yourself and you're good for other people. There's productive, generous peace reigns around you. And you can do that in a playful manner. Now, that's not so bad. You could have that, let's say. And if you can think of something better, well, pursue that. But that's a good start. So that's very abstract. And so now you have to think, well, how might you conduct yourself in order for that to occur? Now, one way of approaching that is to differentiate it. You might say, well, what's the purpose of my life? It's a pretty abstract question. You're going to get a pretty general answer. Now, I could say, well, it's to be willing to adopt this spirit of challenge in relationship to life's vicissitudes. But it's still pretty abstract. So, well, yeah, but how do I go about doing that? Well, you have to differentiate it. That's the bringing of the divine message down into the realm of practical applicability. How do you make that principle real in your own life? Well, here's one way of doing it. Where do people find the significance in their life? So you could envision participating in this process. Well, what do people generally need and want? Well, here we can make a list. So this is, imagine we're taking that general principle. That's the golden cap of the pyramid. That's even the eye above the pyramid. That's another way of thinking about it. It's this superordinate principle, uniting monotheistic principle in some real sense. Now we have to differentiate it. Well, most people would like an intimate relationship. Okay, and so what does that mean? Well, intimate means physically intimate, but it likely means emotionally intimate, and it probably means iterating across some reasonable period of time, unless you just want everyone around from whom you're deriving physical gratification to be the whim of the moment, in which case you're basically a psychopath, and I wouldn't recommend that as a pathway forward. You're a narcissistic psychopath.
And you might think, well, I get what I want. It's like, well, no, you won't, because your life will degenerate. So that's a bad theory. So you want an intimate relationship, and then you're going to have to treat that other person. Well, how? Well, you can win an argument with your wife today, but then tomorrow, there she is in all her defeated glory. And so I don't know what the victory is going to win you. Maybe you want to negotiate towards something like productive and generous peace with her instead. And that's all part of this intimate relationship. And then it becomes truly intimate. And then it's stable across time. And that might be desirable. Then you have a platform, let's say, that will help you stabilize your entire life, because part of the reason you're going to do things is because you want to be of service to at least one other person, and vice versa. Because if it's just for yourself, that's pretty damn dismal and immature and pointless and futile. And it doesn't work anyways. So you've got at least someone else you can serve in this mutually sustaining manner. So most people want an intimate relationship. You know, and they'll settle for second-rate derivations thereof, but still what they want. Fine. Probably want something approximating a family, and even if you're not going to have kids, and I think that's a very bad idea, by the way, not to have kids. Well, you have your parents and your siblings, and if you don't have them, you have your extended family. You might want to stabilize and fortify your relationships with them, because why not? No, why not make peace with your father and your mother and your siblings if you can? And then you get to practice making peace, and then you have a family. That seems okay. And then you probably want some friends. So you could have a vision for your friendships. And what sort of people do you want around you? Well, I can tell you at a minimum, you want people you can tell bad news to, who are on your side during the times of bad news, who don't engage in competitive martyrdom with you. And you want people you can tell good news to, because they'll celebrate what you have to celebrate, and then you can do that mutually. And you want people to exchange your thoughts with, and you want people to play with. And you probably want that to iterate across time, because then you get to know each other and you can foster each other's development in a more profound manner then. And so you're going to be pretty miserable and not very sane without friends. So probably some friends aren't a bad idea. How about a job or a career? Well, why? Because the fundamental state of human being is one of deprivation, and you have to work to address that. So you have to work. And it could be a job, which is something you have to do because you're paid, but hopefully there's some vocational element to that, that you can find some deep intrinsic meaning in your work. And you can certainly do that if you're working with your hands. You can find a sustaining meaning in the responsibility you take in relationship to your job and your career. And then I would say also, if you're good at it, so you're skilled at what you do, plus you're a good team player, I don't care where you're working, it could become a real center of the world for you. You know, when I was a kid, 14, 15, 16, I worked in restaurants for years, and I really liked that. And that's a very complicated thing to do, to work in a restaurant. I was just a dishwasher and then a cook. As I moved up the ladder, let's say, and I learned to cook and I learned to clean and I learned to be hospitable and I learned to work in a complex, dynamic environment, because a restaurant is exactly that. And, you know, I got along with the people I worked with, and I came to work on time and I did my bloody job and I tried to do it right. And so most of the people who were my superiors, so to speak, were happy with me. They wanted me to be there and I wanted to be there. You know, it was still a pain when I was a kid sometimes to have to go to work when my friends were out, you know, drinking beer at the local river. And I might have wanted to do that instead. But fundamentally, immersing myself in that environment was positive in every sort of way and made me more responsible and mature. And I enjoyed it a lot. Many of the best memories I have from my adolescence in particular are the times I spent working in the restaurants that I worked in. And you can do that in a masterful manner. You know, there are great restaurants where you walk in and everything's perfect. It's so hospitable. Everyone is treating everyone else extremely well. The food is of immense quality. Like, that's a paradisal place. And you can work to make that. I don't care where you're working, you can work to make that happen. You can treat the people around you right. You can treat your customers right. You can shed your bitterness and your resentment. You can take on the lowly status of your beginner job as if it's also a field of unlimited opportunity, which it is if you can get your head around it. And then that can be part of the vision of your life. And then you can think about that job or career as something that unfolds and develops across time too. And if you make a commitment where you are locally, I don't care where it is, your opportunities are just going to multiply like mad. You know, so like if you're a short order cook at a restaurant, you have a single shift and you're a really good cook, you'll find pretty soon that the restaurant is much busier when you're cooking and that people are pretty damn happy to be there. And you'll get a reputation with your boss. If he or she has any sense and any greed of the proper sort whatsoever, they're going to recognize you. And then, you know, maybe you move from that restaurant to a restaurant with more possibility, or at least somewhere else with more possibility. And you can do that. I don't care where you are. If you have the opportunity to have a job and you're not working with people who are entirely tyrannical and pathological, if you make the right sacrifices in that position and you have the proper vision, which isn't based on resentment. Oh, why do I have to do this stupid job? It's like, well, it's going to be a stupid job if that's the attitude you have towards it. Instead, if you try to foster all the interpersonal relationships you have in that environment, you'll find that there's an infinite amount of possibility right there in front of you, like there always is. And so, what else? Well, how about some education? You know, you're probably not as informed as you might be, and probably something interests you. It's like, well, why don't you delve into that a bit more and make something more of yourself? Educate yourself to the limits of your intelligence and make a plan for that. And you can do that formally, or you can do it informally. You can do it by reading. There's many great books, and they're not expensive. In fact, the greater the book, the less it costs, weirdly enough. And so you can just do that. You can make a plan. I want to read a book a month, or a book every 6 months, or a book a day. I don't care. Or I want to listen to a podcast a week, or something like that. It's like, expand yourself a bit. Have a plan to be educated. What else? What should you do with your time outside of work? Well, play a good game, right? Maybe you want to do something creative. If you're high in openness, that's probably what you want to do. Maybe you want to take on some civic responsibility and duty. That's what you might do if you're conscientious. Maybe you want to care for someone if you're agreeable. Or maybe you want a new domain for your ambition if you're more disagreeable. Maybe you want to work to make your family more secure. That would be a good way of constraining your trait neuroticism. Maybe you want to expand your social engagements. You're extroverted. It's like, fine, those are good things to do with your time outside of work. They're all matched to your temperament. You can mix and match and do a bunch of those things at once. You know, I used to talk to my students at the U of T and say, well, how much time, by your own definition, how much time do you waste a day? And the median, which is the most typical amount of time wasted, was always about 8 hours. It's like, oh, you waste half your awake time. And you wonder why things aren't going for you that well in your life. You can just do the economic calculations. Well, let's say you're worth $25 an hour, all things considered. Maybe you can't find a job that would pay you that much, but that doesn't mean your time is only worth what you could attain in a given job, because everything you do now echoes into the future. And so let's say it's $25 an hour just for the sake of mathematical computation. Well, that's $200 a day. It's $1,400 a week. It's $5,600 a month. It's basically $70,000 a year. So every year that you spend wasting 8 hours a day, you deprive yourself of the equivalent of a full-time and somewhat generous income. So that's just, and if your life isn't going very well, you might think, well, maybe it's because I waste half of it. That there could be some relationship between those things. Then you might ask yourself, well, what would happen if I wasted none of it, like zero? And you might say, well, how difficult is life? Well, it's ultimately difficult. It's like, yeah, well, it is. So how much of it do you have to use properly in order to contend with that ultimate difficulty? And the answer might be, well, all of it. And if you're not, well, you're going to suffer, obviously, because it's difficult. And so if you're wasting time, then you're going to suffer. And so you might want to have a vision for what you do with your time. And you could ask yourself, well, if I could conceptualize and structure my free time the way I wanted to, what would that be? And then you'll have a vision. And that it's like a revelatory vision in some sense if you ask the question properly, because you can ask yourself these questions. You can ask yourself them in the micro domain. Let's say you come home from work every day to your waiting wife and children, just to take a stereotyped example. It's like, well, you're doing that every day. How would you like that homecoming to go? If you could have it the way you wanted it to be, it's like, what would you like your wife, how would you like your wife to welcome you when you returned home? And then you could sit down and talk to her. It's like, I come home every day. That's every day. That's like 15 minutes of every day. That's an hour a week. It's 50 hours a year. It's 1 work week. It's 2% of my life. It's like, how do I want to be welcomed when I come home? And your wife might say, well, how do I want you to welcome me when you come home? You might think, yeah, well, maybe we could get both of those right together. And then we could be welcomed in a way that was really good for both of us. What would that look like? Well, you know, I'm tired when I get home. And she might say, well, I'm tired too, because I've been taking care of the kids all day. And he might say, well, I don't want to hear about every problem that happened at home the second I get in. And she might say, well, I don't want to hear about all your problems at work right away either. It's like, okay, but we do need to talk through the problems. It's like, yeah, that would be helpful. So, you know, when I come home, why don't I say, honey, I'm home, and why don't you come and give me a hug? And why don't we notice for a moment that we're happy to be together, which is why we got married to begin with, and we could appreciate the fact that we're together, and then maybe we could have something to eat, and we can figure out how to arrange that. And then maybe we could sit for 15 minutes and talk about what happened during the day. And that could be our routine. It's like, well, what do you think of that? Well, here's how I'd modify it. It's like, okay, let's modify it that way. Well, then we'll implement it and see how it works. And then it's like 2% of your life fixed. You do that 50 times, which isn't that many times. It's 100% of your life is fixed. And then when it's fixed, you can even make it better. And doing that 50 times is just not that much. And lots of things iterate, right? You do the same thing every day. You get those things you do every day right, man, you're on the way to having your life together. That's the ritualization of time and space in some real sense. And the application of what's essentially a religious attitude to all the elements of your life that you might otherwise regard as mundane. Oh my God, I have to do the same thing every day. It's like, hey, that's your life, man. The things you do every day. Get those things right.
Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible. And as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough. It's true enough. You're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, you know, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious. You'll take yourself apart. Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future, and you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, so something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. And now it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, well, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is you want to, it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? So that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51%, not half-heartedly. Right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, they're afraid of any number of things, but one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. It's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona, and they'll look around and see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then they won't do it again. So don't do that. But then now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. It's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them. and you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So you know, you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and you know, maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow. You know, now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down, and then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it.
Well, one of the things that I think can be really useful, and this is also a skill that will serve you well for the rest of your life, is to start using a schedule, like a Gmail calendar, and schedule in studying time, for example. Now, so I've got some thoughts about using a schedule. People often don't like schedules because it's like developing your own tyrant. You know, it's, okay, well, here's a whole bunch of things I have to do tomorrow. That's my schedule, and I better stick with it, or I'm a bad person, I'm a failure. And that's not the right way to go about it, the scheduling. What you want to do with the schedule is design the day that you would like to have. Now, some of that's going to involve responsibilities that you have to live up to, or your life will get worse. Right? So, but I would say, if you're trying to start learning how to manage your school stress, is like, schedule in 10 minutes of homework. Maybe before you go to school in the morning, if you can get up. You probably can't, because teenagers have a hard time getting up in the morning. But start with 10 minutes. See if you can train yourself to sit down for 10 minutes after dinner, some regular time, and do 10 minutes of homework. And that's it. Put that in there as a goal. And then maybe if you've done your 10 minutes of homework, you can schedule in, I don't know, 15 minutes of playing a video game if you want, some sort of reward. But start figuring out how to organize your day so that you get to do the things that you want to do, and you do some of the things that you have to do in a manner that you think you could actually do, in a manner that would be sustainable across time. And that, like, the part of your brain that makes you anxious is really unhappy if you don't have a plan. And so one of the fastest ways to start to deal with too much negative emotion, too much stress-related negative emotion, is to make a plan and to make it concrete. And so I would say, and a schedule is an unbelievably useful way of doing that. And you think, in my mind, well, in your mind, well, why am I filling out this calendar for the week? Well, so I know what I'm doing, so that I'm not anxious, so that I'm doing things I want to do, so I have something to look forward to, and so that I'm doing things that I have to do, so that my life doesn't go spiral downhill and make me more miserable and resentful and bitter. And so you can start to use a schedule as your friend, and like, that'll take a year of practice to get good at. So if it doesn't work well in the first week, don't give up. Just keep doing it until you get yourself disciplined and they are able to stick more and more to your plans. And that will help you so much in your life, you just can't believe it. So what you want to do is chop up that overwhelming infinity into a set of manageable tasks. Mm-hmm. And you want to think, well, you know, some of those tasks might be like, well, maybe you could put some order into your room. You know, or maybe you could make your room a little bit more beautiful, or maybe you could think of one thing around the house that you could do that would actually be helpful, and you're doing that to improve your life. That's the point. You're not doing it because someone's shaking a stick at you and telling you that this is what you have to do if you're going to be a good person. That's not the point. And you also, with your schedule, you think, well, I'm going to design this schedule for someone I like. And that person that I'm designing the schedule for that I like is going to be me. And so it isn't the schedule of a slave master to a slave. It's a negotiated schedule that you arrange with yourself so that you can have a decent life. But it's a very powerful tool to have a calendar at your disposal. And if you can learn to use that young, just put a few things in it. Put in your classes, put in a few assignments, put in some things that you might want to do. Just start stupidly and badly, and you'll get good at it over, and assume you'll get good at it over about a year, and that'll change your life. Like if you learn to listen to people, if you decide that you're not going to say things that you know to be untrue, and if you learn how to schedule your time, your life will change for the better so much that you won't believe it, and that will keep happening more and more and more and more as you get older. So it's a great thing to start practicing if you could start practicing that when you're a teenager, and you get that under control by the time you're 18, you'll be absolutely deadly. You'll be so far ahead of other people who don't do any of that you won't believe it, and you'll just continue to accrue benefits as a consequence. Well, the thing is that, or one of the things is that, you are going to be putting up with other people's problems and troubles for the rest of your life. And what you want to do is live your life in a manner that makes all of that tolerable. And so I would say, with the scheduling and with the attempt to speak honestly, and with the development of goals that are valuable to you, you're going to be occupied enough with your own life and see enough of the quality of that life so that you'll be able to tolerate a fair bit of noise and stress coming at you from other directions. And I would also say that the more that you put yourself together in the manner that we've already discussed, the better other people will treat you, and the less unnecessary suffering and distress that you're going to encounter. And I would say, and I'll close with this, I would say to your viewers, don't underestimate the utility of getting your act together. Another thing you can do is, and this is like deciding that you're going to stop saying things that you know not to be true. The other thing is, you could decide to stop doing things that you notice make you weak. And it's a game that you're playing with yourself. It's like you're out with your friends, you do something maybe because you think it'll make you popular, and you notice that makes you feel kind of subordinate and weak, and think, aha, I shouldn't do that again. I don't know exactly what it is that I did wrong, but it made me feel weak. It made me feel like I was coming apart at the seams. It's not the thing I should repeat. So you try to do things that make you stronger. You try to say things that make your speech more true and accurate. You try to aim at things that you think are worth attaining, and you get yourself disciplined and in order, and that will do. There's nothing else you can do in your life that will be of more benefit to you and to other people simultaneously. And if you could start that when you're a kid, man, I tell you, you'll be so far ahead. You'll be so far ahead by the time you're 18 or 19 that it'll be like you're in a different universe.
I had lots of clients and students who were chaotic in their orientation to life. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do about not knowing what to do. It's like, I don't know what to do with my life, and I don't know what to do about my ignorance. And my reaction to that, in some sense, wasn't exactly the reaction of a clinician, because not a typical clinician, because typical clinicians are liberal Protestant in their fundamental orientation, and they tend to think of psychological development as something like self-actualization, right? It's really a self-development process. But that wasn't my observation, partly influenced by the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I had a more communitarian view of human development than that, and my observation was that most people find the cardinal meanings in their life not as a consequence of the development of their self, whatever that is, but in service to other people, in the adoption of responsibility. Because you're told, be responsible, and it's a finger-wagging thing again, that if you were a good person, you be responsible, you do your duty. But no one ever says, well, because that's where you find the abiding meaning in your life, and you need that meaning to sustain you through suffering. And that's definitely the case. I was very ill for a number of years, and a lot of what got me through that wasn't my own special nature, let's say, but the support of my family and the support of my friends and the support of the broader community made a huge difference, not only psychologically, because I knew people were supporting me, but also practically. You build yourself a community, you sacrifice yourself in the service of other people, not so much because you should, although you should, but because that is where meaning is to be found, and you need a deep meaning to sustain you through tragedy. That's the arc.
And you find that deep meaning. And you know, there's a notion that it's better to give to receive than to receive, and it sounds like a Hallmark greeting card in some sense. And people are cynical about that too. Well, yeah, you say that because you should be good and think that. But if you watch yourself, you'll see that it's true, because one of the things that's been really pronounced element in my life is that, you know, people thank me from time to time for things that I've done or said. And there isn't a better experience than that, you know, that you've put something out that's actually a manifestation of what you truly believe, and the consequence of that is part of the redemptive process for someone else. There is nothing that's better than that. Zero, nothing. In fact, I don't think there's anything that's even in the same conceptual universe of that in terms of its intrinsically rewarding properties. There's nothing better than to have people, perhaps particularly people you've never met, tell you that what you have been doing has had a salutary effect on their lives. And so that's a hell of a fine thing to aim for. And why not aim for it, you know? Because you could do it. If you put, I wouldn't even say necessarily that you put other people first, because I think that's a mistake, but I do think it's the case that you treat other people in the manner that you would wish to be treated if you were treating yourself properly. And that's also a sophisticated thing, right? To learn to treat yourself properly. Because that doesn't mean you get to fulfill every momentary whim, because that's what you do when you're 2, and 2-year-olds can't live without their parents. You know, you have to be wise enough to govern your current behavior in light of the future. And that's really what it means to be an adult. It's what it means to forestall gratification and to attain the responsibility of an adult. And the reason that you should do that, because you should, is because it's actually better, you know, in all ways. It's a panacea for suffering to adopt that responsibility. And so I would tell my clients and students as well, it's like, well, let's just take a look at where other people find meaning. You know, and we'll see how your life matches with that. Do you have an intimate relationship? Yes or no? The right answer is yes. Now, maybe not for you, and maybe you don't right now, and maybe you have your reasons not to because you're a singular person in that regard, but probably not. Because that's like a third of life. And so if you don't have that, that might be one of the reasons you're not doing so well. And the fact that you don't have it might be an indication that you're not oriented in the proper direction. Oh, I can give you an example of that. I had many people question me when I was just on tour. This is a question that came up quite rapidly, often in the Q&A sessions. How do I find the right person when I'm dating? How do I find the person who's right for me when I'm dating? And I got that, or on the internet. I got that question like 3 times in a row, and I thought, because I always think this, what about that question? What's wrong with that question? Something wrong with that question. How about, how do I conduct myself so that I am the best possible partner? Now that's a whole different, right? That's a whole different conceptual universe, and virtually no one ever asked that question. And I would say, well, if you want an answer to the first question, which is how do I find the person who's right for me, you actually start by asking the second question, which is what can I bring to the table for someone else? And if you're really good at bringing something to the table for someone else, hey man, people might be lining up to be your partner. And if they're not, then you might think, well, maybe I'm just not bringing the right thing to the table. And that's worth thinking, especially if you're desperate, you're lost, and you're alone. It's like, maybe I got this wrong. And I usually sort of top that with the suggestion that even if you did find the person who was perfect for you, and they're that perfect, what makes you think they wouldn't take one look at you and run screaming away? And they likely would if they were that perfect, because, you know, really, are you that much of a catch? And if you think you are, you know, that might be part of the problem. So that's one, right? Intimate relationship. So I would say to you at the crossroads, develop a vision for your relationship. You know, there's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And you know, it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You know, you're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. You know, it's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's a you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's worth thinking about. So, you know, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, you know, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find, but not without aim. And so I might say, well, look, if you could have the relationship you wanted, you get to have the relationship you want and need, but you have to know what it is. And so then you need a vision of that. It's like, and a developed vision, you know? Not, I need to find the person right for me. It's like, what do you mean by that? You know? How about, how are you going to treat your partner when they come home from work? How about something that concrete? Or how would you like to be treated when you come home from work? Or what sort of partner do you want in relationship to their attitude towards children? You have to make it real, you know, like it's the story of your own life, which, by the way, it is. And then maybe you find it, because at least once you've developed the vision, if it manifests itself, you'll recognize it. That's something. Why don't you set your family right? No, you need siblings. Maybe you don't have them. Set your relationship with your parents right. Fix your relationship with your father, with your mother, with your siblings. The same thing. And then what sort of relationship do you want to have with your children? You know, if you could have what you wanted. I had a very good relationship with my children. My daughter, as I said, was very ill, so that made things complicated. But I had a great relationship, and still do, with my son. It's one of the lights of my life. And we concentrated on making that relationship pristine, you know, both of us, and my wife as well. And so you imagine, well, I want my son to love me. I want my son to respect me, and vice versa. I want a child who can make mature decisions. I want someone I can rely on. I want someone who other people gravitate towards. Because I can have what I want if I'm willing to make the proper sacrifices. And so that's a good thing. Could you set your family straight? Well, you need a job or a career. And so what can you offer, and what can you bring the world in that regard? And then I would say, well, if you're thinking about career success in this Tower of Babel manner, then that's a temptation. But you might think, well, how much good could I do if I had the opportunity in the shortest possible period of time, if I went all in? And then there's an aim, man, there's an aim. And then you might think, well, what would that look like? You know, if I was a light to my community, if I was a light to the people I work with, who would I be if I was like that? And then you can conceptualize that, and you can see when you deviate from it, and why couldn't you correct for the deviations and move towards that? And then you might say, well, are you going to make productive use of your time outside of work? Productive and generous use of your time? Productive, generous, and meaningful use of your time. How about that? You're going to control your susceptibility to temptation, regulate your alcohol and drug use, because alcoholism takes out lots of people. Regulate your sexual temptation. You can control yourself for some reason that's worth controlling yourself for. You know, because there's something to being sybaritic. There's at least the momentary pleasure. It's not nothing. And you're not going to sacrifice that, if you have any sense, unless you sacrifice it to something clearly better.
Agreeableness is a very difficult personality dimension to understand, I think, partly because it's difficult to dissociate from neuroticism and as well from extroversion. Because agreeable people like you, and so that kind of sounds like extroversion, and disagreeable people sound like they're hard to get along with, and they sort of are, but people who are high in neuroticism are hard to get along with too, and they tend to be volatile and irritable. And so most of the time, if you're engaged in a contentious issue with someone and emotions flare, it usually has more to do with trait neuroticism than with disagreeableness per se. So what I'm going to do is try to describe to you what the agreeable trait is on both of its dimensions, and also to lay out the pros and cons of existence on that normal distribution, trait normal distribution, at more or less every point. Because I think, the way I look at it anyways, is that of all the traits, agreeableness is the one that seems to come with the most marked positive and negative aspects, features, let's say, so we don't confuse it with aspects, the most positive and negative features at each point on the distribution. It's a very complex, seems to be a very, very complex dimension. So I'll read you some of the questions from the Big 5 aspect scale, and that'll give you kind of a initial rule of thumb estimate about whether or not you're agreeable or disagreeable. And so here are some of the questions. Imagine that you're answering these for yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. So the first question is, am not interested in other people's problems. So if you are interested in other people's problems, that tilts you towards agreeableness, and I believe that's agreeableness is divided into compassion and politeness, which also sound like very positive things, right? Because everyone wants to be compassionate and everyone wants to be polite, and so you might say, well, is that a virtue? Are those virtues, with the other end being actually negative, to be not compassionate, not polite? It's certainly worded that way, and that's actually a mistake, because we know that these traits are normally distributed, roughly speaking, right? And that means that there has to be positive and negative features at every single position on the distribution. And so to make the presupposition, for example, that being extroverted is being better than being introverted, or that being emotionally stable is necessarily better than being neurotic, is to make a confusion of moral obligation with trait position. You have to assume that there's advantages and disadvantages all the way along, or the distribution wouldn't have set itself up that way, especially because these seem to be biologically instantiated traits. So anyways, if you're interested in other people's problems, they like to unburden themselves to you, you care about it. That's a mark of compassion. If you're more or less indifferent to other people's stupid problems and you wish they just get on with it, then you're less compassionate, you're harsher and more, well, at the extreme, more callous. Let's see. Respect authority. That's politeness. That's part of agreeableness. Rarely, let's see. Feel others' emotions. Compassion. Inquire about others' well-being. Compassion. Can't be bothered with others' needs. Take advantage of others. That's disagreeable, obviously. Sympathize with others' feelings. Avoid imposing my will on others. Wait for others to lead the way. Okay, I think all of those were associated with trait agreeableness or disagreeableness. So let's think about this for a minute. So I'm going to tell you how I conceptualize agreeableness. The first thing you want to know is that women are more agreeable than men, about half a standard deviation. And that's approximately enough so that if you took a random male and a random female out of the population and you tried to guess who was more agreeable and you guessed the female, you'd be right about 60% of the time. So, but what's interesting about that, and this is something also to keep in mind, is about normal distributions, you know. So imagine you have a normal distribution so that most people are in the middle, and then you have another normal distribution, male and female, and mostly they overlap. But you see out here and out here, they don't overlap at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best this is, at worst this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. Okay, now so you kind of understand that. Now the advantage to being agreeable then is that you're good in teams and you're very much likely to give other people credit. The downside of being agreeable is that you're not very good at putting forward your own interests. And so one of the things that predicts salary across time, for example, is agreeableness, and it predicts it negatively. And so it's part of the reason why women get paid less than men. And this is something for the women in the class to really listen to. Because how you get paid across time depends on a very large number of things, right? It depends on your skills and your abilities and your position and your social network and all of that. But the other thing it depends on is whether or not you actually go ask for money. Or maybe that you don't even ask. Because actually you don't ask for money. You tell people that you need to be paid more or something they don't like will happen. And I don't mean as a threat. I mean that you have to be willing, when you're negotiating, to have an alternative. You go talk to your boss who isn't going to give you money because everyone wants money, right? It's a competitive game. You're going to have to go there and say, look, here's what I do. Here's why it's useful. Here's why you have to give me more money. And this is my opportunities if you don't. And then you're not taking your boss's money anyways, because it's very frequently the case that he's working for a whopping big company. But he needs an excuse to give you money because everyone's asking for money all the time. And so you have to put your case forward powerfully and disagreeably. Now, you don't want to do it too disagreeably because then he's going to think that you're a son of a bitch and maybe he's not going to give you anything and maybe you'll get fired for being mouthy and all of that. And that certainly happens to people who are too disagreeable. You got to get the balance right. But it's definitely the case. And the other thing that happens to women that's also worth noting, and this is probably because they're higher in negative emotion, is they tend to underestimate their own utility in business settings, right? Because if you're trying to evaluate what you're like, and you're more tilted towards negative emotion, then the things that you do that are wrong are going to stand out more on the foreground than the things that you do that are right. So if you go into a negotiation and you're uncertain already, because you have self-doubts, and then you're agreeable in the negotiation, what's going to happen is that you're not going to win as often. And winning in a business setting or in a career development setting means more opportunity for promotion and more revenue generated. Now, the downside of that, of course, is as you climb the business hierarchy is that you also have to take on more responsibility. And that responsibility is sometimes unpleasant as well, especially to people who are agreeable, because you're not necessarily liked if you're in a position of authority. And agreeable people really like to be liked. It's their primary motivator because they're concerned about the maintenance, I would say, of intimate, positive relationships. And that also makes them conflict avoidant. The degree to which the world of what matters is the most real is indeterminate because it depends on how you define reality. If you define reality as that which exists in the objective world, then the world of what matters is not fundamental. But it's my observation that we act as if the world of what matters is more real than the world of matter. And I think, in some sense, the most compelling evidence for that, even to a skeptic, and it's a pessimistic form of evidence, but it suffices, sometimes pessimistic evidence is the most potent. The reality of pain is undeniable, and it's not amenable to rational argumentation. It announces its existence, and for a long time, I thought, in some real sense, that there was no more fundamental reality than pain. And there's an ethical dimension to that, too, because if you accept the reality of pain, there seems to come with it an impetus to eliminate unnecessary pain. And to some degree, we can understand that as the basis of the moral impulse, and maybe to eliminate the unnecessary pain of the innocent, like the unnecessary pain of children, for example. And so, well, we accept the existence of pain as something so real that we will almost instantaneously act on it. And I would say that's especially the case in the case, say, of infants. And so it isn't obvious what's real because it depends in some sense on how you define the term. But my sense is that what people believe is most accurately reflected not in what they say or in the propositions about the world they lay out, but in how they act. And so, and that's also something subject to debate, but it's not a shallow argument to say that your belief is most deeply reflected in your action. In fact, I think in some sense it's the deepest of arguments. And you know perfectly well that you can say one thing and do another, and you also know that you regard people who do that as hypocrites, and you tend to regard what they do as a more profound pointer to what they believe than what they say. And so you'll call them on that too. And so that means that there are some meanings that we regard as inviolably real. Now, the reason I concentrated on pain is because it's pretty easy to destroy joy. You can do that with a rational critique, and we're quite good at that. And you can destroy faith, and you can destroy hope, and you can destroy enthusiasm, and you can often do that even with a casual word. But pain is much more resistant to that sort of rational dismissal. I thought over the years, thinking as much as I could about unjust pain, let's say, as a fundamental reality, wondering if there is anything more real than that. And then I would say, well, yes, there is. That which dispels pain is more real than pain. And that's because to dispel something, you have to be more powerful than that thing in some sense. And then you can ask yourself at all sorts of different levels of analysis, what's capable of dispelling pain? Or at least, let's say, rendering pain acceptable, which is not perhaps as deep a solution or as desirable a solution, but is also not nothing. And I would say that many of the things we regard as cardinal virtues are virtues in fact, because if you have them on your side, you can in fact contend with and perhaps dispel or triumph over or transcend the inevitable pain and suffering of existence. And I think one of the fundamental purposes of education is to provide people with the peers and the and the allies, to use a word that's been contaminated so terribly, that enable them to stand up nobly in the face of tragedy and still move forward with what is good in mind. And that's a very different purpose than inculcating in people a thoroughly detailed description of the patterns of the objective world. And I'm not saying for a moment that there's nothing useful about the latter, but the former is people starve and thirst in desperation without the former. And those are realities. Now, as I said, if you start out with the axiomatic assumption that only what is objective is real, well, then that argument falls flat. But I think there's no reason whatsoever not to raise the question of what it is that you're using to base your axiomatic definition of reality upon. And I think that noting what people do is a very good pointer to the real. So here's another way of thinking about the logos. For the world to be intelligible, it must consist of patterned regularities. And that might be the great discovery of the Greeks in some sense, that there are patterned regularities that are superordinate to immediate perception, that are in some sense more real. So number would reflect that, for example. Are numbers more or less real than the things they represent? And you can make an argument both ways, because again, it depends on your definition of real, but it's a very difficult argument to make that they're less real. And partly that's because if you're a master of number, there's almost nothing that's beyond your grasp. So if the depth of your wisdom is reflected in the utility of your tools, then almost nothing makes you more powerful than to be a master of numbers. And that seems to point to an ability to grip some element of a reality that's more fundamental, that is outside of immediate perception. And so one element of the idea of the logos is that there's an order to the world that's superordinate to the apparent order, that's more fundamentally real. And that you can discover that order in contact with the world. And that's the microcosmic world in some sense, rather than the psychological world. And so that seems useful. And I would say these patterned regularities, they're of two types. There's patterned regularities of being, and an object is a patterned regularity of being. One of the things I came to understand as I studied the science of perception is that we don't see objects. We see patterns, and we infer objects. And so the pattern recognition is more fundamental than the object recognition. It's also the case, by the way, that we don't just see patterns and infer objects, we see useful patterns and infer objects. And I don't mean as a second order inference, I mean as a direct perception. And so it's quite obvious. Sophisticated psychologists of perception have noted that in some real sense, the perception of the meaning of a phenomenon precedes the perception of the phenomena. And I really mean directly. And there's much of what you see, for example, is very much associated with what you can grip, because even your vision is tightly associated with the act of gripping, because what you need to see is what will give you a grip on the world. And you might say you see the thing and then determine how to grip it, but that's not how it works. Your retina, for example, which represents patterns in the world, propagates those patterns through your nervous system and manifests itself in such things as preparation for grip. And that's outside of conscious visual perception. And so you cannot make the case that what you do when you perceive is pull in objective sense data and then sort the world from that. The neurological investigations have rendered that presumption invalid. Not only that, there's another problem. Well, let's refer to, we'll do this in two parts. For the world to be intelligible, it must consist of patterned regularities, and they're regularities of being and becoming. Another issue is, when you encounter the world, do you see what's there? And the answer to that is, well, yes, but you also perceive what could be. And so I would say that what you perceive is an amalgam of the patterned regularities of both being and becoming. And you can think about this and make it intelligible. If you think about what happens when you wake up in the morning, you might ask yourself, well, what do you perceive when you wake up in the morning? And you open your eyes and you might say, well, I perceive my bedroom. And I suppose in some very trivial sense that's true, although generally your bedroom is so familiar that you don't need to perceive it. You've already automatized that perception, and it has almost zero functional utility. I suppose you have to perceive it well enough to wend your way through it when you step out of bed, but that isn't really what you perceive, not my experience, and I believe this is a very common experience, is that what you perceive when consciousness dawns in the morning is the horizon of possibility that's associated with the world in front of you. And so what you really see, as far as I can tell, is something directly akin to the chaos that God encounters as the Word, the Logos, at the beginning of time, which is there's pattern regularity of being. That's a solid object because it propagates itself across time in this three-dimensional form. But then there's a cloud of possibility around each object, which is what additional realities it can manifest depending on how you act in relationship to it. And that's not only true of simple objects, because simple objects can be many things. So a heavy drinking mug can also be a weapon, for example, which begs the question of what is that thing? It's a drinking glass and a weapon, and broken, it's a knife. And many objects, if not all, have quite a wide cloud of possibility around them. And then the interactions between objects have a tremendously wide distribution of possibility. And that's the becoming that's implicit in the being. And I think that's actually what you confront when you wake up in the morning. Because generally what happens is that as consciousness dawns, and consciousness is an agent that contends with being and its potential transformations, you see arrayed in front of you a set of indeterminate possibilities which you could bring into being as a consequence of your imposition of vision with some degree of effort and energy. And what you do in some real sense is prioritize and rank order the importance of the possibilities that you contend with, maybe even before you get out of bed. And I would say, in some real sense, if you're not doing that, you're actually not living up to your possibility.
If you could give one advice to us, how we could be able to actually put our opinion out there and to actually make people listen and not to cause some mindless conflict with just yelling, what advice would you give us?
Learn to write. I'm dead serious. Like, I'm dead serious about that. Because writing is formalized thinking. And so the way you write is, first of all, you need a problem. Because why write if you don't have a problem? So this is good advice if you're just writing an essay, by the way, from your classes. It's like, pick a bloody problem that you want to write about, because otherwise it's false right from the start. It's up to you to engage with the material until you find something that grips you, that you desire to investigate. Okay, so you need a problem. Well, the next thing you need to do is, well, you need to have something to say about the problem. So, reading. Reading is really good for that. Read as much as you can. Get your hands on that addresses the problem. Okay, so now you know a bunch of things, or at least provisionally know them. You at least have access to them. Well, now you start sorting through it. It's like, okay, well, maybe I need to summarize what I've learned, and then I need to iron out the contradictions between what I've learned, and I need to elegantly formulate that, and I need to get my word choice right, and my phrase choice right, and my sentence choice right, and I need to organize the sentences into proper paragraphs, and the paragraphs into proper sequence, so that I have a coherent argument. And at the same time, what you're doing is you're integrating your own personality at the highest and most abstract level of organization, and you're sharpening your tools, and you're putting yourself straight, because you're learning to think. You learn to do that by writing. And so I would say, pick some hard problems and learn to write very, very carefully. And when I say pay attention to the word, I mean that. Pick the right words, organize them into the right phrases, get your sentences straight. Like when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I believe I wrote every sentence in that book 50 times. 50 variants of every sentence. I'd read it once, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, and I have a little competition. Which sentence is better? Which sentence is better? I pick that sentence. Do the same with the paragraphs. Over many, many years, you hone your words. They're the most powerful thing about you, bar none. If you are an effective writer and speaker and communicator, you have all the authority and competence that there is. And so you're at university. Maybe you're taking the humanities degree. Well, what's the humanities degree for? To teach you how to think. You learn to think by writing. Now there's more to read, to speak, and all of that. But the best thing you can do is read and write every day. A couple of hours every day. Write about things you find important, and see if you can discover what you believe to be true. And that'll build you a foundation. And it's unbelievably practical. Like if you look at people who are phenomenally successful across life, there's various reasons, but one of them is that they're unbelievably good at articulating what they're aiming at, and strategizing and negotiating and enticing people with a vision forward. It's like, get your words together, man. That makes you unstoppable. And that's the core of the humanities, that idea. Get your words together. Make yourself an articulate creature, and then you're deadly in the best possible way. So, and take that seriously. And I'll end with something too. You students, you might think in your more cynical moments that you have to offer your professors what they want and gerrymander the content of your language to suit their predilections, or what you consider to be their predilections. First of all, it's a very small minority of professors who are corrupt enough to punish you for producing a high-quality essay that they don't agree with. And though that's reprehensible, but it doesn't happen very often. But more importantly, it's the highest academic sin to do that, because what you're here to do is to learn to find your true voice. And every time you deviate from that for expedient reasons, you corrupt yourself. And not in a trivial way, because when you formulate your arguments, that becomes a permanent part of your character. You carry that with you. It becomes part of the structure through which you view the world, and it guides your actions. And so you hold your words pristine, and you work in a dedicated way to become as articulate and clear as you can possibly become. And there's nothing that's more practical and noble than that at the same time. That's why the humanities are so valuable. You think, well, what good is a humanities degree? It's like, well, you come out of here able to speak and think and write,
no matter where you go, like you're headed for the pinnacle, and hopefully in a way that's positive for everyone.
What steps should someone take to start developing delayed gratification when they constantly give in to instant gratification?
Well, okay, imagine, I know the answer to this to some real degree, because I had graduate students in particular who I picked because they were very smart and often very creative, but sometimes they weren't very conscientious. So they had a hard time delaying gratification. And so, well, I would say, if you would like to discipline yourself, which is a very good idea, you need to pick a direction. Pick a direction you want to go first. Pick a goal you would like to attain, and a medium to long-term goal. You might imagine something you need and want, some attainment that would motivate, whose pursuit would motivate you. And you can ask yourself that. It's a good question to ask yourself in general, you know. This is a very good question to ask yourself, is if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would that be? And that's a meditative question. You don't want to force an answer out of yourself. You want to ask yourself that like you would ask someone else. If I could have what I wanted, what would that look like? And you can ask yourself that in a more differentiated way. If I could have the relationship that I needed and wanted, if I could have the friendships, if I could have the job or career, if I could have the educational pathway, if I could adopt civic responsibility in an optimized manner, if I could engage in some creative enterprise, if I took care of myself properly, if I regulated my susceptibility to temptations, what would that look like if it was optimized? And then that sets you up a goal that has some motivational force. This is worth doing. And then you might find, well, you don't do it anyways. And then I would say, well, that's because you're biting off more than you can chew. The next goal is to take your goal and to fragment it into micro goals until you find a micro goal that's small enough that it still presents some challenge that you will do. And so I've become, one of the things I'm known for, I suppose, is my advice to people to clean up their rooms. And the people who think I'm their enemy laugh about that rule because of its simplicity, let's say. But the only reason they think it's simple is because they've never tried it. It's actually extremely difficult. And it was very frequently the case that, well, it's very difficult to put your room, your office, your bedroom in order. I mean, you think about your bedroom, hypothetically, let's say you're married, you share that room with someone else. Is your bedroom in order? Really? And I don't just mean, you know, is it neat? Maybe it's too neat. Maybe it's too orderly. Maybe it's too sterile. Maybe it's too bare. Maybe that characterizes your whole bloody relationship. Maybe, really? And maybe that is genuinely reflected in the state of your room, because it's very probable that that room is a microcosm of your marriage. It's highly probable. And so what that would mean is to organize that room would require the organization of your marital life, not least because if you want to put that room in order, you're going to have to negotiate with your wife about how that's going to be done. And while you're making that negotiation, even in relationship to the micro details, you're going to encounter almost everything that's wrong with your relationship. And so, you know, you might ask yourself when you walk into your bedroom, I hate this bedroom. It's like, you should really think that through. And then you need to think through what you would need to do so that you love that room, or even more complexly, so that you both loved it. Because that's a tough thing to attain, boy. Because you're going to have differences in taste, you're going to have differences in orderliness. There's all sorts of things that you're going to have to negotiate in order to make that room you both inhabit jointly desirable. Anyways, you set yourself a goal, ask yourself what goal you want to set, and then break the goal down into steps that are small enough so that even someone as pathetic as you could manage them. And that requires a tremendous humility. I know it was frequently the case, for example, with my clients, that I would do an analysis of their situation in life, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that someone was 30, living at home, in the bedroom they grew up in high school, in a complete bloody state of disorder, both moral and practical. And one of the relatively simple steps that we might agree upon with regards to moving forward is the person might think, well, you know, I'm 30, I'm really immature, I haven't taken any responsibility for my life, my mother still makes my bed and cleans up after me. It's like, well, why don't you just start with that? You know, because you're not going to just fix your life. Why don't you just try to clean up your room like you're a mature 14-year-old instead of a dreadfully dismal 30-year-old. And so, first of all, it's really hard for someone, even if they're desperate, to admit that that's necessary, right? Because it's so bloody humiliating. I mean, really, I'm so damn useless that my basic goal is going to be to clean up my bedroom. It's like, well, looks like it. And actually, it's worse than that, because then you ask the person, you negotiate with the person, they say, well, I'll try to clean up my room. Then they come back the next week and they say, I had one client, this was so funny, he's going to vacuum his rug. That was his goal for the week. He just had a child out of wedlock, and he was afraid that he was going to be a very bad father, which was a very realistic fear. And so he wanted to put himself together, you know, and so that's why he came to see me. And he lived in this squalor, and one thing we decided to do was that he could vacuum the rug, which he hadn't done for like 12 years because his mother would do it. And so it was so funny, it's so unbelievably comical. He went and got the vacuum, a stand-up vacuum, an upright vacuum, and he brought it into his room, but he didn't bring it all the way in. He put it in the doorway, leaning like this across the doorway. And then instead of vacuuming his room, he stepped over that bloody vacuum cleaner for a whole week and then came and told me that he couldn't do it. It's like, it's not surprising to me at all, because you think, well, that's such a trivial thing. It's like, if it was such a trivial thing, he'd have a clean room. It's not trivial at all. That chaos in his immediate environment was deeply emblematic of the chaos of his life. They were the same thing. And so for him to even begin the process of bringing order to chaos, which is a divine process, by the way, and the highest moral requirement, he had to be willing to face the catastrophe, the chaotic catastrophe of his life. And he hadn't done that for like 30 years. Why was he going to start that week? Just because he said he was going to? It's like, good luck. So what you do as a therapist in that situation is you just make the task smaller until you find a task so small, but still moving forward, that the person will do. So I might have said, I don't remember the particulars of the situation, I might have said, well, do you think you can get that vacuum cleaner, do you think you could move it out of the doorway into your room? That's all you have to do this week. Do you think you can do that? And I'd say that and offer that without being contemptuous. Like, you have to be very careful about such things. And I know that this is more complicated than it looks. And I also know that the first step taken towards the domination of chaos and its transformation into order is a cardinal and difficult step. And so you can make it small, and that's fine, it'll still work. So I might say, well, just move the vacuum cleaner inside your room. And then I would also say to someone in that situation, don't do more than that. If the agreement that you've made with me and with yourself is that that's enough, abide by the contract that you've written with yourself and allow yourself to be grateful for the fact that you had the courage to take even a single step forward. And don't push your bloody luck, because maybe you'll have a brief fit and vacuum the whole rug, and then you'll be so annoyed at how you've destabilized your entire life that you'll redouble your attempts to make a mess, and the place will be more like hell than ever for 2 months. It's very probable that that sort of thing will occur if you break the contract you've set with yourself.
The upside of this is because you think, oh my God, that's so dismal, I have to start that low. It's like, yeah, probably, especially if it's a real difficult thing you're trying to sort out. You have to start as low as you are useless, and that's low. So, but the upside is that progress accelerates, it's not linear, and so if you take once you take the first step, the probability that you'll take a slightly larger second step increases, and that increases non-linearly. And so once you get the ball rolling, so to speak, once you start pushing the rock uphill, you can do it faster and faster. And so even if you have to start in a very humiliating manner, that doesn't mean that's where you'll end. One of the things that Tammy and I learned to do, and this was a consequence of me being trained as a behavior therapist, is, you know, we'll just take an example that maybe I was trying to learn how to compliment her when she dressed nicely. And maybe the fact that I wasn't good at that was manifest in the fact that she'd put some effort into her dress and then I wouldn't respond in the appropriate manner, and that would dishearten her. And I don't particularly remember that exactly happening, but it'll be a perfectly reasonable example. And so then she would be displeased. And then the question would be, well, is she displeased because I'm too stupid to offer a proper compliment? Or is she displeased because she's so needy and lacking confidence that she needs a compliment that would go beyond the ordinary? And the answer is, what the hell do we know? Could be one or the other or both. And so what's a possible solution to that? And one possible solution would be, okay, if you do put some effort into your appearance, or I do, we could reverse the situation, but if you put some effort into your appearance, and you would like to hear from me exactly the words that would give you, that would reward you for doing that and provide you with the confidence to attempt it again in the future, what would those words be?
You look good without a beard, dear.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Very funny. Very funny. And so, and then you can say, well, if you tell me those words, I will repeat them back to you. And then the person who needs the words might object, well, that's false, it's superficial, it's artificial, it's not spontaneous. And if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to tell you what to say. It's like, well, all of that's wrong. It's like, just because I love you doesn't mean I'm not stupid. And so, in fact, I love you might even be evidence that I am, in fact, stupid. So like, help me out here. I don't know what you want, and maybe you could just tell me, and then I'll tell you what you want, and I'll do it stupidly and badly. But I'll be slightly better at it the next time, and maybe if you let me practice 50 times, stupidly and badly, I'll get reasonably good at it, and then that's something that we'll be both good at for the rest of our lives. And that's something worth knowing. You know, if you imagine you're upset with your partner because they haven't delivered something to you, whatever it is that you want, and then there's two questions that arises, right? Are you just like immature and greedy and self-centered, or are they useless and incapable of delivering? And neither of you know, and you have to sort that out. And then you also, as the injured party, let's say, might regard it as a moral necessity on your part to indicate to your partner exactly what you want, just to tell them. Like, it looks to me like if you did this or said this, then that would satisfy me. And then you might say, well, is that reasonable? Do you feel that it would be reasonable for you to offer that? Would you be willing to offer that? Am I pushing you too far? Those are all things that have to be sorted out. And then you can practice that, and you can practice that with the resolution of every dispute that emerges. If you're willing to take to yourself the responsibility of communicating to your partner your conditions for satisfaction. It means you have to admit them to yourself too, which is also very difficult. And then you can help your partner take stupid incremental steps forward, you know, in the direction that you'd like to see expand, and then you can get better at that. And it's unbelievably useful. You can get better at how you have dinner together, or breakfast or lunch. Those things repeat every day, so they're very important. You can get better at how you greet each other when you come home. You can get better at the routine that you
that you fall into, let's say when you go to bed at night or when you wake up in the morning, all these things that repeat, you know, because that's your life, the things that repeat. You can conceptualize how you might like them to be ordered if they were undertaken in an optimal manner, and you can start incrementally moving forward to that. And you can do that by communicating what you need and want, and by carefully rewarding your partner for taking the appropriate incremental steps forward. And so if you're trying to discipline yourself, you make a goal, you break it down into micro goals, and you implement the micro goals and reward yourself for doing so. And if you do that reliably and you make that a practice, that you'll become more disciplined across time, and you'll move towards the fulfillment of your goals. And that's practically how that's the practical guide for success on that front.
If you're being required to do things that make you weak and ashamed, then stop. Don't do them. Like one of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and Frankl was that systems go terribly out of control when people don't stop them when they're going mildly out of control. You know, and you might say, I should just keep my goddamn head down and shut up. It's like, maybe you should. Like, that's not bad advice. You know, you don't want to make unnecessary enemies, and you don't need any more trouble than you need. But you got to ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what makes you think you're not selling your soul? You know, and there's so much foolishness going on in the mid-level bureaucratic world now. That's where all the tyranny seems to be focused. And the reason that it multiplies is because sensible people say nothing when they should say something. And what's so strange about that is that there are way more sensible people than people who aren't sensible. They're just not as noisy. So what you'll turn out if, like, you know, so let's say something's bugging the hell out of you at work. Well, then you have to prepare to find another job. That's the first thing you have to do. I don't think that you should find another job, but you should prepare to find another job. And if possible, you should prepare to find a better job. Because if you can't tell someone to go to hell, then you can't negotiate with them. And if they've got you over a barrel, then you can't say anything. So you gotta set yourself up so you've got some mobility. And actually, that's a really good principle in your life, period. You should set yourself up so that you have a lateral move at hand. And then you should find out, well, are there things at work that are disturbing my soul? You know, and you find that out. First of all, you ask yourself, okay, I'm disturbed at work. Okay, I'm probably weak and deceitful and useless and lazy. You might as well start with that. And then you talk to some people, like your wife, your friends, your co-workers, and find out, are you stupid, deceitful, and lazy? Or is there something not so good going on at work? And so if you can then eliminate your own personal pathology as a cause of your dissatisfaction, then maybe there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And maybe you should say something about it before the whole goddamn thing collapses, because that can happen. It can happen in companies a lot faster than people ever think. You know, and you may find that, well, first of all, you may find if you say something, well, first of all, that's an adventure, that's for sure. That's a bloody adventure. And you have to do it carefully. And you have to be prepared for it. But it might be the best thing that ever happened to you. And the other thing is, if you're careful about it, you get your words right. Like, and this is strategic battle, right? It's not something you wander into carelessly. Then you may find that there's lots of people who feel exactly the same way you do, and that you've actually cottoned on to something. You're a canary in a coal mine, and not just some like psychopathic mouthpiece. So you got to ask yourself when you go and do what you do, like, is this making you stronger? Is this making you weaker? And if it's making you weaker, then you got to ask yourself, do you really want to be weaker? Because the weaker you get, the more you're tyrannized. And then worse than that, like the weaker you get, the more bitter you get. And the more you'll work towards terrible things, the more you'll snap at your wife, the more you'll kick your kids, you know. Like, it's no joke to be tyrannized at work. And so I would say you have an ethical responsibility as a citizen to forthrightly confront creeping tyranny no matter where it occurs. And part of what we're learning, I would say, from these stories, if we're learning anything at all, is that if you're aimed at the good, which is a question you really got to ask yourself, you know, if you're genuinely aimed at the good, then take heart, because you're a lot stronger than you think. what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. I mean, I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. The truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. That it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people, too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
There's this saying that says, tough times produce strong men produce good times produce weak men produce tough times.
Yes.
If that's the truth, which phase are we in today?
Well, if you think about it historically, you have to say that we're in good times. I mean, that doesn't mean everything about the current times are good, and of course life is always tenuous and difficult, but it's 1919. If you go back 100 years ago, imagine what the last 5 years would have been like, right? You would have been, the entire world was encapsulated in a terrible war. The trench warfare was absolutely brutal, and that was a 5-year period, and then that was followed by the Spanish influenza, which killed 120 million people. And you know, so I'd rather be here now than there then by a substantial margin. And I think life is never easy, even under relatively positive conditions. But I would say that speaking on a global level, there's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then, you know, maybe things can continue to improve.
The empirical viewpoint is in some sense that what you know as a consequence of sense data. And the problem with that proposition is that there is mystery embedded inside the axiomatic presupposition of sense data. So behavioral psychologists believe that animals, and they tried to model animal behavior using these a priori theory, the animal reacted reflexively to a stimulus, and so that's a deterministic machine hypothesis. And that always bothered me, partly because animals don't do that. So for example, if you train a rat to run down a maze, it'll learn how to run down the maze. And then if you bind the legs, back legs of the rat, and you put its rear end on a wheeled chariot, it will propel itself through the maze on the wheels. And obviously it didn't learn that reflexively because there aren't that many wheeled rats. And they just don't have that kind of experience. And so the rat's perfectly capable of modifying what it learned in this hypothetically deterministic manner to react to an entirely different set of challenges and come up with exactly the same solution. There was an old behaviorist joke that under controlled laboratory conditions, an animal will do exactly what it damn well pleases. And I like that very much. And the problem with the behaviorist theory of stimulus response was the axiomatic presupposition that the stimulus was given. That you just look at the world and there's the stimulus right in front of you, that takes no effort, and you merely respond reflexively to it. And that's so wrong that it's almost incalculable, because it turns out that perceiving the world is so complex that in some real sense, not only do we not know how we do it, but it looks impossible. And part of the reason that it's impossible, and this is again why empiricism is an incomplete theoretical account of the genesis of knowledge, is that there are literally, or close enough to literally, an infinite number of ways to look at anything. And that's because everything is not only complex in and of itself, at the microcosmic level, almost beyond imagination, but that everything is also situated in a context which is actually a determining element of the nature of the thing, and the context, expanded enough, actually takes everything into account. And so that makes perception a very weird phenomenon. For another reason, I was always amused, for example, when I traveled with my family when I was young, on our summer vacations, we used to do things like get out and look at the border between Canada and the United States. And that's a very weird thing to do, because you can actually do it, and you can step across it, and people treat that as if it's magic in some sense, because part of us knows that that border is not there, right? It's not a part of the objective world, and yet, well, and yet it is, because there you are standing beside it. And then if you look at aerial views, you can see the farmers' fields end exactly where the border is. And so things like borders between countries inhabit this weird space between the objective and the subjective that's a magic space. And it actually turns out that almost everything we perceive has that degree of magicality about it. I've thought also about such things as people's proclivity to go to museums, maybe in Nashville, for example, or Memphis, to go look at Elvis Presley's guitar. And you think, well, what exactly are you looking at when you go look at Elvis Presley's guitar? Because first of all, it's a mass-produced guitar, and so why not just look at another guitar? And you think, well, that's not the same thing. It's like, well, why isn't it the same thing? Because it's not. And the reason is that the guitar is not merely something, and this is the thing you perceive, it's not merely something made up of the guitar atoms, let's say, in the guitar molecules. It's also an artifact that was embedded in a context across a period of time. And that embeddedness of that artifact is part of what you perceive when you see an artifact like a celebrity, something a celebrity owned, or the relic of a saint, let's say. And so, and you can say, well, that's all an overlay on top of perception, and that would be fine, except that's wrong. There's no data, so to speak, that support that viewpoint. That's not how perception works. Perception is unbelievably complicated. So we see regularities of being, and some of those, impediments and affordances is the technical term, we tend to perceive as objects, but we also see the possibilities of being. But the problem with that is that the world of objects, potentially relevant objects, and the world of
possibility is vast beyond our comprehension. And so then we have another problem that emerges as a consequence of that, which is a key and signal problem, and the fact that it has been solved precipitously and carelessly, hastily, is actually the reason for the culture war that's raging today. And that is that we have to prioritize our perceptions. We have to prioritize our perceptions to get access to the sense data that hypothetically informs us. We have to see the world through a system of value. And why would I say a system of value? Well, a system of value is a system of priorities, right? Because to value something is to make it more important than other things that it's being compared to. And why do you need a hierarchy of perceptual priority in order to see? And the answer is, well, you can't see everything at once. And so you can only see one thing at a time. And which thing? And the answer is the thing you think is most important to see at that moment. And then the question is, well, and this is the question, why is that the most important thing to see at the moment? So imagine, this is true in the auditory domain, in the tactile domain, all sensory domains. And you think that perception is a passive action and that we act upon the consequences of our perception, and this is just not true at all. There's no level of the analysis of perception neurophysiologically where you can separate action from perception. So for example, when you're looking at the world, although you don't know this, your eyes are moving back and forth very, very quickly. They have to move. If they stop moving for more than 1/10 of a second, you go blind because you saturate the neurons that you're using to perceive so intensely with the repetitive stimulation that they just shut down. And so at a micro level, your eyes are vibrating like mad, and then there are saccades above that that are still unconscious, that are less rapid and wider, and then voluntarily, you have voluntary eye fields in the frontal cortex, you move your eyes voluntarily to point to what you want to see, and you do that because the center part of your vision is exceptionally high resolution. Each center vision foveal neuron is connected directly to 10,000 neurons in the primary visual cortex, and then each of those 10,000 is connected to another 10,000. It's very expensive neurophysiological real estate, and if all of your vision was as intensely high resolution as your fovea, which is a very small part of your retina, you'd have to have a brain like an alien.
I plan on taking my own life very soon. Why shouldn't I? Well, I'm going to assume this isn't a casual question, that's being put out for the purposes of display. Well, the first thing I would say is you have to think very carefully through the consequences of that for other people. So I've had clients in my clinical practice who never recovered from the suicide of a family member. Decades later, they're still torturing themselves about it. And so that's what you leave behind. Now, the problem is you might be dreaming about that, because maybe you're feeling that life has been twisted against you and that people deserve to suffer for the misery that they've imposed upon you. But I would say, think very, very carefully before you go down that route. It's a terrible thing to leave people with. And so part of the reason that suicide has been illegal in most societies is because it absolutely devastates the people you leave behind. And you might think, well, if you're really depressed, then maybe you're really depressed. That's a possibility. You might think, well, those people would be better off without me. It's like, and if you get really depressed, you can think that way, and you can even get to the point where you can't think any other way than that. And I would say, if you're at the point where you can't think any other way than that, then you should tell someone and you should go to the hospital. Because that can happen, it can happen if you get depressed. And there are treatments for depression, and many of them work. For some people, antidepressants work like mad. Now, they don't work for everyone, and I'm not claiming that they're a panacea, but they certainly beat the hell out of suicide, right? And even if they have some negative side effects, and sometimes they do, quite frequently they do, the negative side effects aren't fatal. It's like, well, there's the possibility that your condition is physical, that you're ill in some way, either physically or perhaps you have a psychological problem. Maybe you were hurt or I mean, there's lots of reasons that people get depressed that are very, very complex. I would say don't give up hope and do something final before you've explored all possible options. And if you haven't talked to a psychologist, you haven't talked to a psychiatrist, you haven't tried antidepressants, you haven't revealed to your family or people that care for you that this is how you're feeling, then you owe it to yourself and them to explore every possible avenue before you take such a step. And then you don't want to deprive the world of what you can bring to the world. That's the other thing, you know, you have intrinsic value, and you can't just casually bring that to an end. You leave a hole in the fabric of being itself. So, you know, a wise man that I once worked with said, he was a very strange person. He was a psychologist at the maximum security prison in Edmonton, and I worked with him for a while, briefly, very briefly, at the prison itself. And he said, you can always commit suicide tomorrow. And that's a very, like, it's a flippant statement in some sense, but he meant it in a very serious way. It's like, you only get to decide that once, and you can put it off. And so I would say just put it off, and then put it off some more, and then put it off some more, and see what you can do to put yourself together. You know, you explore every possible option. And if you're so hopeless that you have a suicidal plan, which is a real sign of danger, if you really know how you would do it and you've thought it out, then I would say, tell someone, for God's sake, tell them, or go to a hospital and tell them. And for sure, try antidepressants. But what the hell do you have to lose? So do everything you possibly can to address the issue before you do something like that. And do give some thought to the people that you're going to leave behind, because believe me, you may just absolutely wipe them out in a way that they will never recover from. You cannot fix someone's suicide. You're stuck with it. And you think you torture yourself for the rest of your life. If I would have only known, if I would have only said something different. This particular client talked to her relative, a sibling, who committed suicide like 20 minutes before he committed suicide, probably after he took the pills. You know, and she was kind of preoccupied because you don't know that the person at the other end is at the end of their tether. And she never forgave herself for not responding properly in that last phone call. That's a hell of a thing to leave someone with. And the final thing I would say is, don't be so sure that your life is yours to take. You know, you don't own yourself the way that you own an object. You have a moral obligation to yourself as a locus of divine value, let's say. You can't treat that casually. It's wrong. So those are the reasons. Explore everything you can explore to put yourself back on your feet. All the things, there's all sorts of treatments for depression. Don't leave the people around you with that to suffer from for the rest of your life. Don't underestimate your value in the world. And don't underestimate the fact that suicide is wrong. And so those are 4 reasons why you shouldn't end your life soon, or at all, for that matter. So,
our daughter ended her life at 24 due to depression. If someone is determined to end their life, how can one change their mind? Oh, well, first of all, I'm very sorry about that. That's a terrible thing. Look, I had this friend. Sorry. There's been a lot of depression in our family, so it's a question that cuts close to the bone. Anyways, I had this friend, a friend of my parents, and her granddaughter committed suicide, you know. She was just beating herself up about that. What could have I done? What could have I done differently? This is the problem with suicide. It leaves everybody behind thinking, oh my God, what could have I done? I could have treated the person better. I could have listened. I could have been there. It's like, and she was just beating herself up about this, really feeling that she wasn't a useful person, that she'd failed as a grandmother. She's a really good person, you know. And so I went for a walk with her, and I said, and she's married and she likes her husband and he's a really good guy. And I said, look, you're blaming yourself for your granddaughter's suicide. It's like, are you blaming your husband? Are you sitting him down and telling him what a useless bastard he was as a grandfather because his granddaughter committed suicide and how he failed completely? She said, no, I'd never do that. So I said, well, don't do it to yourself. No. Depression is a terrible thing. And many, many, many things cause it. And we don't understand. We understand some of them, but lots of them we don't understand at all. You know, sometimes people get depressed because they're really sick. We know that depression can be an inflammatory disease. It might be associated with autoimmune dysfunction. There's lots of reasons that people get depressed, and depressed people can go places that are so dark you just cannot imagine it. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always rescue someone, you know. But drowning yourself in the aftermath of a suicide is not helpful. So there's a good room for self-forgiveness there, you know. I mean, maybe you did some things you shouldn't have done that were reprehensible and all of that, but you don't want to beat yourself up. Remember the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And you have to apply that to yourself. I think there are times when people are so depressed that there isn't anything that anyone can do. You know, and the depressed person thinks, and this is probably the worst part of it, the depressed person thinks, everywhere I look, it's nothing but catastrophe. And I can't see any way out of it. I can't see any path forward whatsoever. And then they think as well, and maybe it's the combination of these two thoughts that really make people suicidal. It's like, it's hopeless. It isn't going to get any better. No matter where I turn, there's no escape. The suffering is unbearable. And I'm absolutely no use whatsoever to anyone. It would be better for everyone if I was just gone, because if I'm not so much of a burden now that it's going to destroy their life, then I'm going to be that much of a burden in the future. And so it's hard to imagine what that's like for people, but it's dreadful. And there's lots of ways you get there. And so you can listen to people. You can desperately encourage them to seek the help they need. You know, like I've seen antidepressants work miracles on very, very many people. Now, they don't work for everyone, and they're not a panacea, but, you know, they have side effects and all of that. But one of the side effects of untreated depression is that you kill yourself, and there is no recovery from that. And the probability is actually rather high. So you can go to war with them about antidepressants. If the person can't get out of their depression and they're suicidal, it's like, what do they have to lose? 1 month on antidepressants. They'll know. Well, they might have to experiment longer, because it would depend on, you know, some people respond better to some classes of antidepressants than the others. It's worth having a war with someone if they're in dire straits and they won't do everything they can to get better. ECT works, electroconvulsive therapy works for intractable depression. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, but the modern versions of ECT aren't. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. And again, it's like, there's no coming back from death. So, look, it isn't clear. You can't rescue everyone. People get sick and they die. And sometimes the way they die looks like it's depression. Depression is a multifaceted phenomenon. You can be there for them. You can listen. You can watch. You can intervene. You can try to understand. You can hold them accountable. You can do all of those things. But everyone has their own destiny, you know, and you're not omnipotent. And so sometimes a catastrophe occurs, like your daughter's. And then you should try to drag the least amount of misery forward that you can. Once you recover from your grief.
You know, if you take people, then you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. Probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you. If you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. It's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them. And then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work because, like, you got no shortage of flaws, and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again, but maybe you can do it. And then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. so anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart, and so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good. That sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know, and I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas. Often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do, because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic?
So you're at a particular stage right now, and that stage would involve a particular worldview and the behaviors that go along with that. So the perceptions and behaviors. But it's not enough, because you haven't mastered the whole world and you're making mistakes all the time. And then there's other neurological mechanisms that, so maybe that's a more left hemisphere phenomenon, the instantiation of that identity. Then there's right hemisphere mechanisms that are tracking your errors and sort of and keeping track of them. And the errors are an indication that your theory is incomplete. So the errors accumulate, and the information around the errors accumulate, and another identity starts to become formulated, and it solves all the problems your previous identity did, but also some additional ones. When you have an aha moment like that, it's the manifestation of that next identity that's making itself known. It's you know, because it's being built from the bottom up. It isn't explicit yet. And then you'll encounter an explicit statement. You mentioned a couple there, and they map onto that. And that's the aha. It's like, oh yes, that's what ties together these things that I've been wrestling with in the back of my mind.
I realized that the site was infested with videos of real sexual crime, and that Pornhub was not a porn site. It was actually a crime scene. And that's kind of how the
Is there a difference?
There is legal material. I mean, legal pornography is legal under the laws, you know, of the United States, of Canada. But when it's a child, or when it's, you know, a non-consenting adult, or when it's even filmed consensually and uploaded non-consensually, there's a spectrum of abuse. This was the business model. They were selling 4.6 billion ad impressions on Pornhub every day, and that was how they were generating their traffic.
Any idea how much money is being generated by this site?
Yeah, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars a year is generated for MindGeek, ILO, off of...
How do you spell ILO?
AYLO.
ILO, and that's the rebrand.
That's the rebrand, right? And so intentional decision, and I mean, over the course of the last 4 years, you know, as this kind of started to go viral on social media, you know, a petition that I started in early 2020 to shut down Pornhub and hold its executives accountable. You know, today we have 2.3 million signatures from every country in the world. And as this was spreading, victims were coming forward, and whistleblowers and insiders from the company were coming forward, and they taught me not just, you know, how this content was getting uploaded, but why it was getting uploaded. And again, it's the business model of free user-generated porn.
Yeah. Why do you think they're not more careful in drawing a line between what's legal and acceptable, at least legally, and what's illegal and sadistic and criminal? Is there something about, okay, so here's part of the reason I'm asking this question. So I spent a lot of time studying the perceptions and actions of very, very pathological people. And one of the things that is interesting about serial sexual killers, for example, is that their behavior tends to accelerate across time. And there's a very specific reason for this. So sex has an intrinsically rewarding nature, but that the nature of anything that's rewarding can be heightened by novelty. So because novelty itself, if it's in the right dose, is also gives you a dopaminergic kick. Sexual anticipation and sexual pleasure produce a dopaminergic kick, but novelty heightens that. Okay, so what that tends to mean, especially if you're overdoing it, let's say, is that you want to stay on the novelty edge, right? So what you see with serial killers, for example, who have a sexually sadistic twist is that the sadistic element in their crime accelerates across time as they search for that edge to stay where things are maximally gratifying. And so there's reasonable evidence that the same thing applies to pornography use online, is that maybe it starts out with relatively vanilla displays, but then it progresses to more and more graphic displays, and then past graphic, there's kinky, and past kinky, there's violent, and past violent, there's violent and kinky, and that's not as far as it goes. And so you can also see this culturally. You know, Theodore Dalrymple, who's a very interesting British essayist, made a lot of this when he was talking about how porn invaded our culture, that the borders were, what would you say, moved bit by bit, really starting in the 1920s. He identified a famous case. Who was the novelist? Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned as a pornographic novel in Great Britain, and it was quite sexually graphic, especially for the time. And that ban was overthrown, and he thought of that as although Dalrymple is a free speech advocate, he thought of that, the victory of, I can't remember who the author was, actually quite a renowned author, the victory for his novel as the entry point of the pornographication of the culture. Okay, but over the course of my life, I've seen in our culture the same thing that happens to people who become increasingly sexually perverse as they chase the novelty edge. Because when I was very young, let's say, it was Playboy that broke the barrier fundamentally, right? That was Hugh Hefner, and Playboy was a relatively sophisticated magazine for a porn magazine. Most of the images of women were nudes, but not sexually explicit nudes, merely nudes. And there was a lot of journalism in Playboy and some very good writing. And Hefner kind of marketed that as bohemian 1950s, freedom and equality between men and women, the cool single person who was willing to explore their sexuality in a creative manner. And that was Playboy. And of course, that empire lasted for quite a long time. But then after Playboy came Penthouse, and Penthouse was much more sexually graphic, a lot more explicit. And after Penthouse came Hustler, and Hustler started to move into you might call it into the domain of severely bad taste. And that was certainly the case. And then, by the time then Hustler metamorphosed into, dozens and dozens of magazines that concentrated on every fetish you could possibly imagine. And then the internet came along, and it was the case that the expansion of the internet was actually facilitated in a major way by the desire of isolated and socially incompetent men to share sexually graphic images. I mean, the whole internet was driven at, we know what, 1/3 to 40% of the traffic on the internet is pornographic still. And so it was an incredible, the sexual element was an incredible motivating factor for the development of the World Wide Net. And there's a lot of criminal activity on the net, maybe 50% of it, right? And it's very hard to hold people accountable. So what we're seeing is our whole culture chasing that novelty edge, and that's all driven by, in the worst cases, narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian, sadistic criminals, and we can't hold them accountable. It's really bad. It's really bad. Okay, so now...
But we can hold those who are distributing it accountable.
Okay, can we?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Who are these people?
Well, first I want to kind of just, basically acknowledge what you just said is absolutely true, is that today on these free porn tube sites, again, free, you just, there wasn't even an Are You 18 click-through button at the beginning of 2020 where any 7-year-old could just click right through, end up on the homepage of Pornhub or X videos for free. And what they're seeing on the homepage is not your father's Playboy, right? It's not the images that you were describing. It is, there was a study done that was published in the British Journal of Criminology, and they analyzed the home pages of these sites. And when you get onto Pornhub, there's about 50 videos that you will see that if you scroll over, they autoplay. And these are these homemade user-generated videos, and they found that 1 in 8 of those videos was displaying sexual violence, videos that would include non-consent, incest. And I think that is just so alarming that is the reality that we're living in today.
Well, exposure also desensitizes, right? So if you're a therapist and you want to reduce the anxiety that someone feels, well, I can give you an example. I had a client one time who was a vegetarian, and but this person was a vegetarian because they were really terrified of life and of death, and couldn't go into a grocery store. And so because of the displays of meat, and one of the things that I did was bring them to a store that was closer and closer to an actual butcher store, and have them look, because that's what you do. You have people look at what it is that they're terrified of. And if they do that voluntarily, their anxiety levels decrease. Actually, they become braver, but fundamentally, you could say as well that their anxiety levels decrease. And so the revulsion that young people would feel for violent acts is, especially on the sexual side, is going to be reduced as a consequence of that kind of voluntary exposure. And God only knows what that does. I mean, I can't imagine. And it's an unbelievably powerful force too. We're in a situation now where a 13-year-old boy, because it's going to be boys, mostly men, using these sites because men are much more sensitive to visual stimuli. Women seem to prefer literary pornography.
Although there are many, it's increasing, the number of girls.
Do you know what the proportion is by any chance?
I don't know that exact proportion.
Yeah.
I do know it's still boys primarily that are primarily being exposed, but girls as well are consuming this kind of content at very young ages as well.
Yeah, well, curiosity is going to drive that to some degree. Right? There's a great book by the Google engineers called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Do you know that book?
No, I don't.
Oh, that's I think the best book I've ever read, investigating the use of the sex difference, for example, and the use of pornography. It's a very smart book. And so we're in a situation right now where the typical 13-year-old boy can see more beautiful nude woman than any man ever saw in history, right? Incredibly powerful, possibly irresistible stimulus package. And we also don't know exactly what that's doing to the relationships between young men and young women, sexually and otherwise, right? There is increasing evidence, especially in countries like Japan and South Korea, although the transformation curves seem to be playing out the same way in the rest of the West, except delayed. There's a tremendously high rate of virginity now in Japan. I think it's something like 30% of Japanese young people, 30 and under, have never had any sexual encounter whatsoever. The relationship scene is fragmenting in those countries. The birth rate has absolutely plummeted. And we have no idea what the connection is between that and the very straightforward and simple sexual gratification that's available online. We also have no idea how it is that young people's sexual preferences are trained as a consequence of their exposure to online pornography.
It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like, if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise, you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, you know, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, you know, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So, and you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And, you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.